We're continuing to have a deeper look at the epistle, the letter to the Hebrews. So I want to open up and have a look at the first few verses as we look at this letter to the Hebrews. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke... Hang on a minute. This doesn't sound like a letter. In fact, this really doesn't sound like a letter. How do we think this is a letter? This is not the letter to the Hebrews that I was expecting, like, hello, this is Fred writing to such and such. There's none of that. And that's what we're going to have a look at now, because this is not a letter. And I want to show you why. So in reading the opening verses of Hebrews, we are struck by how unlike a letter this sounds like, especially if we're familiar with the letters that are already in the New Testament and are already described as letters using the biblical word, the ancient word, an epistle. An epistle is essentially a letter. So let's be reminded of this. We have a look at the opening verses. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God, and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. So that certainly is not the standard pattern for a letter, an epistle in the New Testament. What we have here is something that is something else. It's not an epistle. Hebrews is not an epistle. I want to show you how we know this. Firstly, there's no identification of the author, which was a standard practice in writing an epistle. Secondly, the author failed to identify the recipients. Now, we've already discussed both of these matters. We can come to some conclusions about it, but we can't be absolutely certain. Thirdly, as in the other epistles that we have, there doesn't appear to be a prayer for the recipients, a prayer for grace or peace. And then fourthly, there's no expression of thanksgiving or blessing that the recipients meant to the writer, the author. And fifthly, the opening 4 verses, which I've just read, are written in a way that it actually sounds like an introduction to something that's about to be written. And interestingly, what we have is very little evidence that the church ever actually really thought of this as a letter. In fact, one of the reasons it became thought of as a letter occurs in the 3rd century, the very early 3rd century, when an ancient manuscript was found, and it refers to it not as the letter to the Hebrews, but simply to the Hebrews. And it seems that people just assumed that this was something that, well, it must be an epistle then. And that was the reasoning behind this. But what we actually have is a description of what this to the Hebrews is all about, occurring right near the end of this document. And we find that in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 22, where it says, I appeal to you, brothers, bear my word of exhortation, for I have written to you briefly. Now that word of exhortation actually means something. What we have is this original concept that it's to the Hebrews. As I said, the oldest copy that we have of Hebrews is the Chester Beatty Papyrus P46. Now it's P46 because the P stands for papyrus, and the number is the fragment that we have of that papyrus collection. And in this ancient copy of this document, Hebrews, some scribe at some point has put to the Hebrews. and has put it in amongst Paul's epistles, not his other epistles, but Paul's epistles, which then led people to assume, well, Paul may have written this, or this could just be another letter that's been written. And that's how it became known as essentially the letter to the Hebrews, as I just read in the English Standard Version, which is there's a small point to be made here, and that is sometimes what publishers do to the original text is sometimes not helpful. And in this instance, I'm saying it's not helpful. Now, in Hebrews 13, verse 32, it says that the writer was claiming that he had written this document was a word of exhortation. If you're into Greek, hot logos, tes paraklesios. And so that word of exhortation, or that word of encouragement, seems to be an expression, a figure of speech, meaning a sermon. And we find that expression in Acts chapter 13, verses 15 to 16, where the apostles Barnabas and Paul have gone to Pisidian Antioch on their first missionary venture. They've already gone to Cyprus, and now they're heading into Asia Minor. And they do what is their standard practice. They go to a synagogue, and they, at the synagogue, and as is probably a custom, they are invited by the rulers, the leaders of that synagogue. If you have a word of exhortation and a word of encouragement, please share it. And so then we find in these verses, Acts chapter 13, verses 15 and 16, after reading from the law and the prophets, the law, the Torah and the prophets, Nevi'im, the rulers of the synagogue sent a message to them, that is Barnabas and Saul or Paul, saying, brothers, if you have, here's the expression, any word of encouragement for the people, say it. So Paul stood up and motioning with his hand said, men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen. And this is exactly the expression used in 13 verse 22. I appeal to you, brothers, bear with my word of exhortation, for I have written to you briefly. So with this in mind, we then have some fairly recent research where there are some scholars who've looked into this quite with a great deal of depth, and one of those was a German theologian who in the 1960s spent quite a while researching other related documents, and his name was Hartwig Thien, who demonstrated in his book published in 1969 that Hebrews was actually a sermon. Another word for sermon is homily, and the German word for sermon is homily. And so he gave certain reasons why this should be considered and recognized as a sermon, because it has the classic elements of a sermon. These include a paranetic section. Paranetic section where the writer is writing in a way that says, come on, this is what we need to do. This is what we should do. So it's paranetic. It's an encouragement to do something. And so there are paranetic sections in this document, the document of the Hebrews. Secondly, throughout Hebrews, there is drawing on the Septuagint. It's symbolized, as already mentioned, as LXX, standing for the Greek number 70. So the Septuagint is the document that Hebrews draws on particularly, and probably, as we've already seen and will see, an older copy of that Greek manuscript, that Septuagint. And so the sermons that were around this time that we have in records of, they do this as well, drawing largely on the Psalms and the prophets, as we've just seen in Acts 13, with the Psalms and the law and the prophets, together that's called the Tanakh. That was what was used in the synagogue. Thirdly, the author of Hebrews has a high-level command of the rhetorical devices that were used in that day. These rhetorical devices, as we'll see in our next installment when we'll actually dial this down a bit closer, a rhetorical device is meant to make a case and persuade. That's what a rhetorical device is. So to use rhetoric was to present something in a way that you were convincing, leading people to do something with what you have just said. So rhetoricians in the first century were essentially the lawyers of today. Fourthly, in this document, Hebrews, it does what the other documents that are known to be homilies would also do, and that is it cites other authors, whether they be Hebrew authors or Greek thinkers or whatever. And so this is happening in this document as well. So it's following the standard practice for what a sermon in that day would have looked like. And fifthly, it concludes with, here's that word again, paranetic instructions. So paranetic instructions essentially means if you want to live ethically, if you want to take what has, the case I've made through the rhetoric that I've offered you, then this is what you must do. And that's exactly what we see here in this document in chapter 13. Chapter 13 is a paranetic conclusion. In other words, the last thing you leave with your audience is the big so what? So what now? What do you do? And so what we have here is good reason for thinking that Hebrews was a sermon, a homily. With that in mind, we should be able to look at this now in a different light. The writer is making a case, that's rhetoric. The writer is trying to persuade people of something. In particular, we've already seen that the major theme in Hebrews is that Jesus is the eternal Son of God. And then the writer is preaching a sermon that leads people to do something about what they've just heard. Come to think of it, that's what a sermon is today. I would suggest that this document would have been the basis of something that someone would have stood up in a group of believers and just shared from their heart. And it would have brought that power, that encouragement to live differently. That's what a sermon is. So a sermon is not just instruction. A sermon is not just information. A sermon is also inspiration in the sense of you're inspired to do something about it. That's what a sermon should be, which is why I'm a big fan of preachers who master the art of preaching rather than simply reading their sermons. Now, with that in mind, I want to continue diving deeper into this document to the Hebrews. Not a letter, a sermon. And in doing that, as I said, in our next section, we're going to look at the rhetoric that's being used in it. In the meantime, I want to pray for you that God will open your eyes and your heart and your ears to hear his word in a way that perhaps the writer to the Hebrews was longing for his audience to have as well. So Father, thank you for those who've joined with me now. I pray, Lord, especially for preachers who are joining with me, that, Lord, they would begin to learn how to hone their craft and develop their skill, that, Lord, they might also be a persuasive speaker. Father, I pray that churches would have pulpits where preachers would set their church ablaze with spiritual passion, and that, Father, as people see them burn for the Lord, on fire for the Lord, people would come for miles to be a part of the witnessing of the fire of God. And I pray for this in Jesus' name. Amen. If you haven't yet subscribed or hit the notification bell or given this a thumbs up, please do. I'd really appreciate it if you left a comment in the section below, just letting me know if you're following along. If you've got a question, leave a question there. If you've got some feedback, some reflection, leave that there as well. If you're able to share this, I'd really appreciate it. And you'll see me in our next installment as we go deeper in this document to the Hebrews.